I got a Twitter challenge that my outfit today wouldn't be as fantastic as something I wore a couple of nights ago, and there we go. So I'm going to invite the panelists for this section to come up and at least have a seat while I do my opening remarks. First, Her Royal Highness Princess Sarah Zayed of Jordan. Next, we have, yeah, okay, so everybody needs to do something fun when they come on the stage. Okay, yeah, something like that. Next, we have Mr. C.K. Mishra. No dance? Okay. And last but certainly not least, we have my colleague, Peter Schiefke. So I'm going to do my opening remarks, and then I'm going to allow each of you to briefly introduce yourself when you're answering your questions, because I think you will do a better job of introducing yourself than I possibly could. But I'd like to say good afternoon, and that I'm pleased to be here today to moderate today's session on convening global leadership to unleash the power of adolescence. Our panelists today have a broad range of expertise for what should be a very interesting discussion on how we can advance adolescents' health and well-being and how we may realize progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Canada recognizes that healthy adolescents, particularly adolescent girls, are critical in our collective success in implementing and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Youth participation is a key policy commitment for the Government of Canada. Therefore, we strongly believe that adolescents need to have a meaningful seat at the table, not only for progress to be made, but to ensure that we are accountable for our commitments. And of course, we do have a Minister of Youth who's also a Prime Minister, and we're lucky to have the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister here with us in Peter. Of key importance is that both male and female adolescents need to have access to the full range of sexual and reproductive health services and information to be empowered to make informed decisions free from discrimination and stigma about their bodies and their futures. This includes access to age-appropriate, comprehensive sexual education, family planning and contraceptives, safe and legal abortions, and post-abortion care. As stated in the recent Lancet report on adolescent health, the most effective actions for adolescent health and well-being lie in sectors beyond health service provision. To improve health outcomes for adolescents, multi-sectoral approaches that seek to address the social determinants of adolescent health and contribute to their empowerment are key. And so, without further preamble, I will ask our distinguished guests to please introduce themselves in responding to these questions. So I will sit. Is this on? Yes? Okay. It is on. So I'll address the first question to yourself, Princess Sarah. So we know that about 1.8 billion of the world's population between the age of 10 and 24, more than ever before, are the larger population. Adolescents are a critical group for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals. How can adolescents, particularly young girls, be more genuinely engaged to be part of strengthening global health, and what are the barriers to their engagement?
Thank you very much. And again, I'm so honored to have the opportunity to speak and to share my thinking with you. Although this time it's got nothing to do with me. I have a cheat sheet because last year, for the first time, the UNHCR and the Women's Refugee Commission convened a global refugee youth consultation. And the great thing about that is that it happened, that it took us until 2016 to make it happen is one of the things that we need to sort of rather urgently rectify, that if we're actually going to do this, we do it now and we do it properly. And then they came out with this excellent report that looks at adolescents and youth that are displaced, that are refugees, and in their voices, it talks about the barriers and their vulnerabilities and their strengths, and it gives detailed recommendations about what it is that they would like to have happen.
Excellent. So I'm going to move over to CK. And so of that 1.8 billion, 238 million youth live in extreme poverty. Where are the most vulnerable often left behind, and what changes are needed to achieve SDG 1 and end poverty, particularly with children and youth?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for giving me the privilege of being here. See, poverty amongst the youth is one of the critical issues. That's a very interesting question for the simple reason that when you know that 89 million of them live in less developed countries, so those are the places where poverty is. And when poverty strikes a family, the most affected is the young population. You know, all our planning processes we've had so far, we've been talking about children, we've been talking about the elderly, but this critical segment, that is the youth, has been left out. And we've, as a government, across the globe, not invested enough. And perhaps those who have invested have not invested well enough in this population. So poverty is very critical. And you know, SDGs talks about the identifying, you know, the poverty, inequity to the most vulnerable sections. But if you really want to address the issues of poverty in youth, one of the critical things that we need to do is to create a socially acceptable social protection scheme for them. You know, when poverty strikes, the first thing that happens to the young man is that his right to education goes, health goes. So if you can create a social protection net where he has a right to health, right to education, some kind of support in that, he becomes a part of the mainstream. And the second very critical thing is that you invest, whatever you do in the youth, you invest in association with him. So unless he's a part of your thought process, he or she, you are not able to move ahead. So it's a crippling thing. Therefore, you need to really make right investments. The government need to think about it. And unless you're able to reduce poverty in the younger population, you are not going to see them. And in fact, if you ask me, there are three critical things. You need to invest in adolescent, access to information and services. You need to create an atmosphere where you can translate evidence into action, which is for the adolescent. And also, you need to ensure meaningful engagement of the adolescent in the entire process. Then you bring him up with poverty.
Excellent. So I was remiss in not asking my other panelists to answer or to provide some commentary on the first question. Clearly, I'm not used to this moderating stuff, so I will take the opportunity to do it with the second question and ask Peter, do you have anything to add in terms of what changes are needed to achieve SDG 1, ending poverty, and particularly with children and youth? Has this come up with the Prime Minister's Council, for example?
Well, first of all, thank you. I think I want to address the first one, which are what are the barriers to their engagement, to youth getting involved in finding solutions. And I think that one of the things that far too many governments or people in general underestimate is the sheer capacity of young people. And they do so to their own detriment. And I think that the best thing that we can do is to give adolescents, young people all around the world, a stronger voice. Not just paying lip service, but actively giving them a seat at the decision-making table where the discussions are held about the programs, plans, and policies are put in place to benefit them or not to benefit them. And you know, one thing that people don't realize is young people are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They're more aware, I think, than any other generation, particularly because of social media and the information that's been able to provide to them. And that's allowed them to understand the challenges on a global context that face them. and understand that the solutions aren't going to come into place overnight. They're not asking for one-size-fits-all solutions. They're asking for a seat at the table to be a part of putting in place those solutions that are going to work best for them. And the one thing that I'm incredibly proud of, and I heard that there are members of the Prime Minister's Youth Council that may be present here today, is the fact that the Prime Minister truly understands this. And he's put in place various measures, one of which you mentioned, which is the Prime Minister's Youth Council, which is 26 young Canadians from coast to coast to coast that sit down with the Prime Minister in person several times per year for 3 days in a row to discuss issues of concern, not just to the Prime Minister, but to them. They are able to set the agenda and find solutions for some of the challenges that we face here in Canada. Now, that works in a Canadian context, but there are definitely solutions in a global context that could be applied that would have the same impact in providing that voice that young people deserve.
So, Princess Sarah, I'm going to sort of tweak the question a little bit and pose it back to you. When we look at SDG 1, when we look at poverty, it is a huge and complex situation and challenge for the world. Where should we be focusing our efforts? How should we sort of prioritize what we look at and what efforts we take?
I think that there are concrete actions that we can work through. We talk about giving young people voice, participation, and so on. These are all very important, but slightly more difficult to touch, to monitor, to understand genuinely if it's actually happened. I was very taken this morning by the gentleman who said that his sister had not spoken to her 3 brothers or to her parents about what she was experiencing as she was walking backwards and forwards to school. You know, the space that we have to somehow create around a young person so that they feel empowered or unthreatened, or that they can raise sensitive things without judgment. Desperately important, but not easy to figure out how you and I can do that, with the exception of in our own little words. But there are some things, and for me it all goes back to displaced young people, to humanitarian settings. And if you put yourself into the shoes of someone young who has been displaced or is in a humanitarian setting, and if we say that the average amount of time to be a refugee is 20 years. So you have a young person who wants to participate, but there are too few employment and livelihood opportunities, difficult in accessing quality learning, education, and skill-building opportunities, difficulty with legal recognition and obtaining personal documents, lack of safety, security, freedom of movement. All these things, if you have young children, adolescents, grown-up children, and you think about the fact that my 14-year-old daughter cannot go very many places in Manhattan without an adult, or if it's in the wintertime when it gets dark at about 4 o'clock, she can't do things unless she has the logistics that are established for her to get safely around the city. She's not going to go on the subway by herself. It's safe, but I'm not going to allow it to happen. So even in my own life, I have to think about the concrete things that happen. For my son to have access to something, he needs an ID. He needs to be able to identify himself. To apply to a summer camp, you need to have transcripts. You need to have someone that's going to write a reference for you. How does any of that happen when you have been displaced, when you have no documents? And that is where we can come in. That is where we have influence over universities, over high schools, with innovation to try and put things online, to allow curriculums to be more accessible, no matter where you are, to provide people with documentation. And these are tangible things that we can do. We can do them quite quickly if we really apply ourselves and want to make a difference. So it's a long answer.
Princess Sarah, you sort of eloquently talked about leveling the playing field, so to speak, if we're able to implement some of these changes. So, CK, if I could go back to you to the first question in terms of wanting to engage adolescents in our challenges around the Sustainable Development Goals, what are some of the barriers to their engagement? What do you envision as that?
See, in terms of barriers, if you ask me, it is about empowerment, it is about agencies. That is the most critical issue. And it flows out of education and financial independence. If you look at this very closely and follow up how it happened within the society, you then go on to the social, cultural, behavioral norms, where when you talk about the social, cultural, behavioral norms, the biggest barrier lies there. How do you change the thinking? How do you change the norm, the behavior? I mean, one has to accept the fact which Peter was just mentioning, that there is exceptional quality in the younger generation. We need to recognize it. I am a father. My daughter decided to do something completely different, which for a long time I didn't even understand what she was going to do. She decided to become a dance movement therapist. But the fact that she was empowered enough to make that choice, she's a happy person, doing well. Not many have that. That is the kind of, atmosphere, the ecosystem that you need to build. But having said that, whether it is about the youth having a choice or it is about youth being a part of every discussion, it will not happen and merely remain words if the government does not put in a structured system to do it. It all has to fall on a platform of structured policy and program. One example I'll quickly give you. In India, after a lot of consultations with the youth and every other stakeholder, we launched one of the extremely ambitious programs called the RKSK, that is for the adolescent only. And that program really focuses through the adolescent in a structured way for their growth. You talk about right to education, you talk about skilling. In fact, skilling is one very critical thing that Sarah just mentioned. The government of India realized recently, last year, in fact, year before last, that skilling was so critical that was what, India is talking about 253 million adolescents, please. So that is the kind of number. They created a separate ministry for that. So you have to provide these basic platforms if you really want to pull them up. And one of the biggest barriers, according to me, is behavioral change.
Yeah. So as you were speaking, I just typed a question related to the breaking down of cultural barriers. So you could put all the systems in place that you would like, but if on the ground level, or if within homes, within communities, there are those cultural barriers to say that girls shouldn't go to school, or, children shouldn't have a say. How then do we engage more youth? How then do we allow for these changes to happen? So I wanted to talk particularly about some of the cultural changes that need to happen, and I put it to you, CK, or to you, Peter, from what you're hearing from your group.
Well, first I want to just touch upon something that CK just said about education. I think that education is the key. And it sounds cliche to say, but if you invest in education, you invest in the health and prosperity of your country and the people living in your country. It also coincides with what you're talking about with culture, because you can be brought up a certain way in your home and you can have certain cultural norms in a community, but when you go to a school and you're able to learn and you're able to expand your horizons because you had access to that additional information that opened up a whole new world for you and perhaps made the whole community understand the importance perhaps of empowering young girls and the positive aspects that can be reaped from doing just that. I think that's where it is. I think it's about education, making sure that you provide equal access to both men and women, boys and girls, and making sure that they have access to both primary and secondary. And I know you know this, the first job I ever had was working in East Africa in Uganda. And we were working there providing support to people living in refugee camps because of the ongoing war with the LRA. And the one thing that we saw, which was transformative in the country, is that during the period of time that we were there, the government implemented for the first time ever free primary education for all Ugandans. And it had a transformative effect on the country. And it led to now a call for free secondary education. And we're seeing positive impacts in terms of equality. We're seeing positive impacts in terms of economic growth. We're seeing positive impacts in various areas of the country. And it's all because of the government's decision, rightfully so, to say education is something that we should be providing to all citizens.
So leadership at the top. The Princess Sarah or CK, do you want to add to that?
See, you just mentioned leadership at the top. The entire game is about political commitment and leadership. See, because families, the first reaction is to help them just survive. If you want transformation, if you want them to thrive, there has to be a political will and commitment which will drive that. Without that, you don't get into these issues. And you said, what do you do about behavioral change? It's the most complex thing. But one thing that you can certainly do is enable them to have a choice by perhaps doing as much as you can to make them economically independent. That will kickstart the entire process.
I have two things. One is an obsession with a multi-sectoral approach, which is something that every day, at every level, we need to keep making sure that we are doing. So if we're looking at schools for young people, we need to make sure that the water and sanitation and the health and hygiene facilities are there, that the nutrition is there from a very early start. We can no longer work in columns and think that we're actually going to achieve a different outcome for anybody. And then it's very slow. We know exactly what it means in the US, in the UK, and so on. Early childhood development is a key for children and for families, I think, because we lose them once they go to school. It is the building blocks that you get at home that you then take with you. Tolerance, gender equity, programs that, behavior change, wash your hands after you touch something, and all of these sorts of things. And it's also, these are messages that go up through the family. Sesame Street and the IRC are working to try and build and bring sesame to refugees, in Syrian refugees. And the idea that you can get information in a wonderful, gentle way to our very smallest people, but also through the parents. These are lessons that will last for generations, that they will teach for generations, and they will empower for generations.
I think that just to work off of your point, the SDGs do a very good job of teaching us how everything intersects and to stop working in silos. Peter, I'm going to just pose a question to you.
Sure.
In your experience, what are the best examples of innovation and partnership used to improve health? Whether we're talking about SRHR, whether we're talking about nutrition, data collection, mental health, what are some of those?
I guess my response to this is based on my experience working in the field, and it would be that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for it. And that, for example, in the case of northern Uganda, you were dealing with different communities, different realities, different needs, and every single one of those communities had to be approached in a different way. It had to be worked with in a different way. And more importantly, from the grassroots level, from the ground up. So it's not the most effective solutions that I've seen in the field are ones where you don't go out with an idea of what to do. You go out and ask. and say, what is it that's going to work for you? If this is our end goal, how are we going to achieve this goal? How is it going to work for you? And then not impose, but actually put in place solutions that reflect the needs of every particular community. And so I would say it would be to combine both, as CK pointed out, kind of a national objective, but with the sensitivity to the differing needs of different communities and different regions.
Very good. So, CK, I'll pose the same question to yourself. Some of the best examples of innovation and partnership.
See, as far as work for adolescent and youth is concerned, if you have more of the same thing, nothing is going to happen. So innovation is the key. And when you talk about innovation, you know, when we globally, all of us sit and write down prescriptions for innovation for the world, it doesn't really work. Global prescriptions are very good, but what ultimately works is what works on the ground, and that has to be country-led. So it's the country perspective which is critical and which will actually make it happen. Therefore, innovations must happen at the country level. And as Peter was mentioning, it's got to be different for different geographies. So the innovation has to be local. I mean, the thought process could be global, but the innovation will have to be local. Each of the programs that you design will have to fit into the requirements. And when you innovate, we must ensure that the adolescent and the youth is part of that process of innovative thinking that you're coming up. In fact, if you ask me, most of the thinking is going to come from them and not from us. So we need, the biggest innovation we can do is just keep looking at them, listening to them, and perhaps we'll get the answers.
So country-led, oh, go ahead, Peter, yeah.
Sure, I actually just wanted to support what was just said by CK and go even further. Young people have this ability to see the world not as it is, but how it can be. And somebody who did a really good job, I guess, of capturing that was former President Bill Clinton through the Clinton Global Initiative, where he had these awards that were given out every year, and they were challenges given to young people. And some of the solutions that were put forward that ended up winning the grand prize, if you will, were put forward by 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. One example that comes to mind was how do we stem the tide of fake drugs making their way into communities, antiretroviral drugs. They would be taken by middlemen and replaced with ineffective drugs that weren't actually doing what they were supposed to be doing. So how do you make sure that those who need these medications are able to get these medications? And he came up with a solution. He said, you know, no matter where you go anywhere in the world, even in the most impoverished communities, you will always find a cell phone. You will always find a mobile phone. And he came up with an application that allowed for the largest producers of these antiretroviral drugs to create a scan code, a barcode on those capsules that then could be scanned by the recipient, and they would receive a confirmation message allowing them to know that the medications they received were actually the medications that were sent to them by the organizations. That's the kind of innovation that we can expect from young people if we empower them and we bring them in to the solution, the search for solutions.
So country-led, local actors,
Doom and
Princess
gloom.
Sarah.
Doom and gloom.
No, are you going to bring the cloud?
No, I
Okay.
can do the doom and gloom, and to be controversial. We have to always bear in mind that not all countries, not all leaderships, not all governments, not all adults have the best interests of their people, populations, women and girls at heart. And in almost every conversation, we have to end it by thinking about the girl that doesn't have access to a cell phone, the girl that can't read, the child that that is never going to be empowered because she was married at such an early age or has a disability. We constantly have to take ourselves, if we are true to the spirit of the SDGs, to that furthest place where there is no electricity, where literacy is poor. Yemen, there are 11,000 suspected cases of cholera at the moment in Yemen, a country that was devastated before the war began. How are we going to empower the young people in Yemen? The median age in Yemen is 19.5. What are we going to do right now for the adolescents in Yemen that will allow them to survive, that will allow them to thrive, that will empower them so that they can contribute to a healthy, thriving country that has to deal with droughts and patriarchy and these sorts of things? We just always have to take ourselves back. Barcode's fantastic, but only in some places. Governments, country-led, brilliant, but not everywhere.
So now that you brought the cloud, where is the sunshine in that? I'm going to put it back to the panel because clearly you bring a very valid point that not everywhere we're going to be able to have this sort of great innovation and, children and youth engaged. What is the silver lining to this situation? We don't just say, okay, well, forget it and throw our hands up in the air. What are some of the potential solutions to, again, engage those young people in situations where it is likely not possible? Throw it back.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that the capacities of countries differ. One of the mandates of the global leadership should be to create those capacities wherever they are lacking. Having said that, I would still feel that the countries, even with least capacity, are in better position to think of themselves than the others who think for themselves, for them. They would still be more empowered and better placed. Yemen, for example, perhaps somebody needs to find out what is it that the youth of Yemen need. They have n number of problems, but what is it that they need first? So that is where our policy should involve. And if the global community can create capacities in the countries which do not have that, that is the biggest empowerment, which will lead to further empowerment of the youth in those countries. Because even if you give the best prescriptions and the capacities are not there in the country, it means nothing. It will never get implemented. Ultimately, what is it that we want? We want some results on the field. That is the critical place we want to reach. So I do agree that there are different capacities, and some places it may work, some places it may not work. But then that's the way the structure is.
Anyone else? Peter? Chris and Sarah?
Go ahead.
I think my silver lining is the individuals themselves.
Yep.
It's the strength and resilience and determination of the individual. You know, and what it is that a mother, an auntie, a grandmother will do to protect the young people that are in her care, how far she will walk, how much she will struggle. That strength and determination is unstoppable if we can unleash it.
So I'm going to leave the last question with the elephant in the room. I don't know if you guys noticed the elephant, but there is actually an elephant in the room. And talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so we know that adolescent health is at the heart of SRHR. And everyone has heard the news coming out of the United States. Are we using innovation to our approach to addressing adolescent health within the context of SRHR. And Princess Sarah, you had the opportunity to be at the announcement with the Prime Minister,
yes.
and where our government committed $650 million to SRHR. So,
Yeah.
I was not expecting that, but thank you. So you were at that announcement. Are we using the best innovative approaches to empowering young people when it comes to their health, and in particular, sexual and reproductive health and rights?
Oof, that's a very big question.
I'm giving the last 15 minutes. You have 5 minutes each.
Well, I'm just going to take a little piece of that. I don't know what the answer is, but what I do know is that that what Canada has done, the leadership that Canada is showing in stepping forward and being willing to make this powerful catalytic change in the entire global landscape is incredible, and to the opportunity for all of us that is created by such a leader that is willing to push forward so that we can all continue to come in behind is extraordinary, and for that we are all incredibly grateful and supportive and waving the flag.
Excellent. ZK?
With your specific question on SRHR, I don't think many of the parts of the globe we are taking the correct approach. We are seeing it as a health issue. Now let me give you one example. If early marriage is one of the critical elements of sexual and reproductive health, nothing except education will help that. If a girl studies at a particular level, those many years have gone by, so she marries a little later. So it is always a multi-sectoral thing that we need to look at. If we look at it in verticals and compartments, perhaps we'll never succeed. And it is particularly true for the youth, because that is one segment of the population we need to be very careful with. If you really want to get dividends, demographic dividend, you have to groom that segment. Otherwise, that can turn into a liability. And particularly with reference to their health, in India, we recently did an experiment called Saathi, where we got the youth from villages as volunteers to talk about sexual reproductive health and help others. And the kind of atmosphere that was created was that they would come back to the centers in the evening, telling them what went wrong during the day. So if you can create that kind of an atmosphere, which is multi-sectoral, where the schools are coming in, where sanitation is coming in, and other aspects are coming in, perhaps we can create a much better world for them.
Excellent. Peter?
It's a loaded question, and I don't think there's, you can answer it in 5 minutes or less. But I think if you're asking from an overarching perspective, what's missing in the current ecosystem, I think it's the basic understanding of the importance of the investments in reproductive health. And the fact that we're still in a situation where the health of so many young girls and women around the world are dependent on certain players globally in regards to the funding for specific programs internationally. And we saw it recently. We saw it recently where one of the largest players in the world decided to cut their funding from key investments that we know, if we're using evidence-based approach to trying to find solutions, would have a negative impact on countless women around the world, countless girls around the world. And it came to the point where other countries, and I guess this is the silver lining, said, no, we're not going to allow you to do this, unilaterally do this. We are going to come forward and provide the resources that you withdrew from so many young girls and women around the world. So I guess the problem is that we're still in a situation where it is so reliant on a key few players. But the silver lining is that we're showing that there's an international community now that is seeing and more recognize the importance of this and came in and ensured that the funding was indeed put in place.
So I think Canada did good on this one.
Canada, in my opinion, did very good on this, and I'm very proud of what we did. Yeah.
Go ahead.
May I just add one thing to what CK said about multi-sectoral approaches? We haven't talked about a strong justice system, and so we need to make sure that laws are enforced. If you sign up to treaties, if you pass a law saying that children cannot be married under a certain age and so on, these laws must be enforced. And you must have a judiciary and civil society and so on, strong civil society that can make sure that these laws are passed and that politicians and justice officials and so on are held to account in every setting.
So again, we hear this sort of whole of community approach to dealing with various issues, justice, education, other systems that need to be involved in order to adequately address this issue. So we have about 7 minutes left in this panel. I would just leave it to each of you for any closing remarks that you would make. Anything that we didn't cover in our discussion, I'll open it up to each of you to make final remarks.
Thank you.
Let's start on Peter's end.
So we'll start with me?
Yeah.
Sure.
You know what, we didn't do a very good job of introducing ourselves either at the beginning. We just jumped right into the questions. So maybe you could just weave in a little bit of that, although I think we got a sense of who each of these individuals
You
were.
can't be doing it at the end. Everybody.
I know, they already know who we are. We didn't do a good job, but I think we got a good sense. But Peter, I'm just going to,
Sure.
final comments.
I hope you'll permit some leeway here. I actually want to, first of all, if we're talking about introductions, before becoming a politician, because you're automatically labeled as a politician the moment you get elected, but I think a lot of us don't like the term politician. A lot of us served the community in some way, shape, or form. And the first job I ever had was working in Uganda, as I said earlier. It was the best 5 years that I think I ever spent in my entire life. And the work that was done on the ground by so many incredible people representing so many incredible organizations, and the devotion, the energy, the drive that people had to try and find solutions for some of the problems that we were facing on the ground is something that I'm going to never forget. And I feel like tonight, or this afternoon, I have an opportunity to thank all of you who are continuing to do the work that you're doing. That's having an incredible impact on so many people all around the world. I don't know many of you, I've never met many of you, but I feel like this is an opportunity for me to say, you are the ones who are making the difference on the ground. You are the ones who are having the impact. And so from a personal perspective, I just want to say thank you, and keep up your amazing work.
I would fully agree with that. As a career civil servant, I often think of structures and systems, but just look at this room. The kind of wisdom that rests in this room, the very issue of innovation that you raised, I think some of the best answers could have come from here, and perhaps will come from here. I mean, 5 minutes may not be enough for all those innovative ideas to come in, but there's so much of wisdom, and everybody is thinking. The only thing is that we are not the academia, the NGOs, the civil society, everybody is thinking. We are not able to channelize them in the best possible way to reach the last man where the effect needs to be felt. So I guess we all need to create that chain which will reach the end. And perhaps one of the ways of doing it is not leave it to government alone. It should not be. Government can be the catalyst. The actual carriers have to be the rest of the society, the civil society, the academia, the NGOs, whoever is involved. If we are able to create that team, the message will reach. If the message reaches, the behavioral change will come, and things will become much better.
Thank you. Princess Sarah.
This might be a bit all over the place, but this morning, Minister Bibeau said that we had to use our stories. And then the Deputy Secretary General talked about her 6 children. And it's true, a lot of what moves us comes from our experiences. And a part of my story is that when I gave birth to my 3rd child, I had this rare and catastrophic event happen. I had an amniotic fluid embolism, and I'm not supposed to be here, to the point where after I was recovering, the surgeons and doctors and nurses and so on that had been part of all of this came into my room with their arms open wide saying, "Thank God you're alive. We didn't think you were going to make it." It's not words anybody actually wants to hear. Well, exactly. But what I have been, how that changed me is that, I know that there are all sorts of, minutes and inches, why is it that something happens? Because you were in the right place at the right time, and the baby was already birthed, so she wasn't affected, and, all sort of wonderful statistics. Secretly, I think that some of it is all about bloody-minded determination. I was not going to die. I was not going to leave my 8-year-old son, my 6-year-old daughter, and my new baby girl. It just was not going to happen. And some of that sort of bloody-minded determination is what we have to bring to each and every single day of the work that we do. My story now is that I am, physically scarred. I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I am, so far from being, a healthy individual in all sorts of different ways. I am damaged as a result of all the things that I have been through. But they are my tiger stripes, and I wear them with pride, and they are what makes me a strong woman who will stop at nothing to protect the people around me or to give voice to the people that do not.
So thank you very much for a very productive and informative discussion, Peter, CK, and Princess Sarah. I would like to thank Global Affairs Canada and CanWatch for organizing this event, and to commend the efforts of Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health, the Every Woman, Every Child initiative, and the World Health Organization. As a mom myself, my children are very political. I say I play a politician on TV. They're the real, activists in the room. And my daughter always says, if you want to have a discussion about youth, make sure that they're there. She actually says it with a lot more attitude than that. So as we conclude this panel, I want to challenge us to ensure that the important issues that we've discussed today are disseminated to our young people, that they're actively engaged, and not just the ones who have the honor and privilege of being in this room, but to those beyond the walls of this space, to ensure that they are also actively engaged in this discussion. We need to think creatively and collectively about what more we do to unleash the power of adolescence and how we mobilize the resources to do it. So thank you very much to each and every one of you. I'm going to talk for the last 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're out. Yeah.